Welcome back, Battle Lab followers and Patreon members. I appreciate you supporting our channel and being here again. You can find us at www.battlelab.us as well as on Patreon, as just mentioned. Today I wanted to take a look at Canada and what's going on there and relate it back to the instruments of power that we've been discussing. It's important to take a look at this because oftentimes we believe that instruments of power are projected outwards and are for use against foreign enemies and nations in competition with our own. However, in this case, in Canada, it really shows that the instruments of power work in both directions, towards the domestic populace as well as a foreign enemy or foreign competitor. So take a moment and consider what's possible with what goes on in Canada and the Canadian trucking convoy and freedom movement concerning mandates. Early last week, we saw Justin Trudeau enact emergency powers in Canada concerning the Freedom Convoy movement that is addressing a protest of mandates and choice and the lack of choice concerning vaccinations in Canada. And what's grown out of that protest is an opportunity to look at the instruments of power and how Canadian government has responded to dissent amongst their own populace. So let's use the midfield acronym and take a look at what's going on in Canada and the government response to the protesters. So the first part of midfield is M for military. And while we're not seeing military forces actually being used in Canada, what we are seeing is the enactment of emergency powers that allow the law enforcement component of the Canadian government to be much more forceful in their activities in managing the protest. That's an important point. Also, informational, the next instrument of power is been very tight-lipped and put to the test up in Canada. Canadian news is actually run by the Canadian government. So you're not seeing a lot of news sources that are coming out of there from their mainstream media that are supportive of the protest or sympathetic. So it's important to understand that the Canadian government has a strong grip and control on their components of media. D for diplomacy. Trudeau has decided not to address or talk or discuss or communicate with the protesters about their grievances. That's an important point. The Canadian government, given his stance, has not been diplomatic. When we're looking at the acronym, we also have a financial component to what the Canadian government's doing. And this is an interesting point. They've decided to target certain protesters in the dozens right now and go after their financial banking institutions and having their accounts frozen. Also, they're collecting as much as they can on any individual that's been part of this protest for further investigation further down the line. So the possibility of those folks having their bank accounts frozen and the funds they're captured will also be in play. You also have seen over the last 72 hours, Canadian banks have had a banking run because Canadians are worried about finances and being able to access their finances if they've been seen as sympathetic to what's going on with the protest. These are pretty tremendous measures for in 7 to 10 days of this protest, having the Canadian government come out and do these activities and actions. They are definitely being forceful. They're using their financial instruments. They're enabling their police to be more militant. And along with that M that we discussed earlier, they have arrested and detained a number of the key leaders of the protest. I believe they're being charged with just criminal mischief at this point, but who knows what they'll concoct in their legal their legal approach to this. And it's important to consider that. So you've seen a more militant stance taken by the Canadians. The information war with the media, they're controlling the narrative. You're seeing the diplomacy or lack thereof that Trudeau's approached. You're seeing the financial approach that the Canadian government's taking by trying to have records seized, financials frozen, and more potential problems for those people that are a part of the protest because of that. These are all things that you're going to see continue to cascade forwards. Intelligence-wise, this is an important note. So now that these new emergency powers have been enacted, the police are now collecting data on the protesters differently. And this again will affect them down the line. They're using facial recognition to identify these folks. They're using all kinds of cameras, controlling and seeing who's supporting them, who's sympathizing with them, and using all of the branches of technology that are a part of the intelligence gathering at this point to capture and for later prosecution and for later parts of lawfare, actually nail these folks down to the wall. Now, realize this. This protest is about choice. That's what it's about, and it's been peaceful up to this point. It's not what we've seen in Seattle or response to the George Floyd riots in 2020. We haven't seen this kind of violence and eruption and property destruction and all these things. This Canadian protest is nothing like that. It's been incredibly peaceful. So we're seeing Justin Trudeau in the Canadian government lurch further and further down a road of tyranny and fascism and an autocratic government by doing what they're doing in response to a civil protest. This is not new territory, but it's definitely stiffening territory in all of the West. Australia's also had a very strong response to what's happened with folks that are refusing, dissenting, or protesting the mandates and approach to managing the vaccinations and COVID problem overseas and in their country as well. What will be interesting to see is what's the cascade effect of all of this in the United States. There's now a trucking movement in March that's being assembled to push from California to Washington, D.C. It'll be interesting to see how the United States now manages and prosecutes their instruments of power, given what's going on in Canada. Considering and continuing with the economics part of the instruments of power, imagine now showing dissent actively to your government, even in peaceful dissent, and that government now coming back and absconding or freezing your finances, making it impossible for you to live, possibly taking the licenses like they have or are looking to do in Canada with these truckers, and taking your livelihood away. So there's an economic instrumental component to this as well. So all of these acts of using the instruments of power on your own domestic population will have second and third order of effects. Lawfare, once again, the L part of the acronym of Midfield. You're going to see this play out in court, and it's going to be over months and months and months, just like you've seen the Democratic Party and Congress in the United States drag out the January 6th protests and civil disobedience that was going on there. You're going to see them use this as an apparatus to forward their own political agenda, an agenda that's not in alignment with quite a few of the people of Canada. The last one is development, and development's the last D in the acronym. And in this case, what develops from using all of these other instruments of power and connection and in support of each other in Canada against their own domestic populace? What kind of developments will we see? Again, what are the second and third order of effects of this? Is there a chilling of freedom? what kind of things can that do to the development of their nation and their own agendas? It's important to see this through the eyes of policy and the eyes of the legal system, as well as what this Canadian protest has been all about. So what's going on with the Freedom Truckers is incredibly important. I hope everyone's watching that and taking notes. Apply midfield, that acronym of midfield, to what you're seeing go on in Canada. It's incredibly important you do that. Thanks again for being here with me on Battle Lab. I hope you join us on YouTube, on Patreon, on Twitter, on Facebook, or at our website itself at www.battlelab.us. Thanks again. See you soon.